In this video we're going to look at the generation numbers that MapMate stores for each record that you have in the database. The generation numbers are used to track when the records were added to the database and to make sure that when you generate a sync file it picks up all the new records since the previous sync file. For the most part, these generation numbers are just used internally by MapMate for the purpose of creating sync files, and you don't normally need to worry about them for entering your own data and analysing it. But there are some cases where it is useful to know what the generation numbers are and what they're telling you. So we're going to have a look at that and also at the way the archiving system works in MapMate. To start with, let's go to the Help menu, and if we click on About MapMate, this is the place where you have a reminder of what your Centre Unique Key, or CUK, is for your copy of MapMate, but it will also tell you what the current generation number is. And as time goes on, this number will increase. Exactly when it increases is a bit difficult to work out, but it certainly increases each time you create a sync file. And as I say, over time that number will steadily increase depending on how busy you are with your copy of MapMate. The other place where you can see the generation numbers is from the data entry screen. And if we find a record to look at, let's simply go to the Records menu and show the last record that was entered. If you look at any record in this data entry view, at the top right there's something that says Owner, which, as it's telling us, shows the CUK from the person who entered that particular record. But if you click on this Owner label, you have another option to say About this record, which again reminds you of the CUK of the person who created it, but it also gives you the full unique key for that particular record, and it also gives you the record generation number. So this is the number that MapMate assigned to this particular record as its generation when it was created. Or if it's a record that you've synced into your copy of MapMate, the generation number shows the point at which the sync file was imported. I'm going to find another record to look at by seeing what else is present at that site. So let's go into this record, and again a rather similar looking data entry window. The same owner created it. Let's click on here and About this record, and this time the record generation is still 21, but it's shown as -21. And this is how MapMate tracks which records have been edited. There's obviously been a change made to this record since it was originally created, and such a change won't change the generation number of the record, but what it will do is to put the minus sign in front of it so that MapMate knows it has been changed. This is how MapMate knows to include edited records when it sends sync files on to somebody else. One of the reasons for knowing about generation numbers is because it comes into play if you need to archive any of your data. So what does archiving mean? Let's go into our analysis section, and we will run a query to get all the records for a particular site. I'm going to use the same site example that we were just looking at, with just 2 records here. Now, imagine that for this particular site, Hurley Riverside, it's possible that that's a private site and the landowner doesn't want the information to be passed on to anybody else. The archiving process in MapMate is a way that you can set a selection of records to be put into the archive. What that means is that they won't get passed on if you create a sync file. So, for instance, if you were about to send your records to your BSBI county recorder, but there was a particular part of the data that you didn't want to include in the sync file for some reason, perhaps you're still checking through it, for instance, then what you need to do is to get all the data that you don't want to pass on into one of MapMate's browse lists. For example, you might want to send all of your records except those for a particular site where you're still checking through them. So if we browse all records for a site, and let's say that the 34 records for this site are ones that I don't want to pass on just at the moment. If you highlight any one of these records and then right-click over it, you'll see a series of options here, including the ability to archive the selected record. And if you click on that line where it says Archive Selected Records, you'll get a message warning you that it will permanently archive that record. Although it tells you this is permanent, it also tells you that you can reverse the process, so it's a strange definition of permanent, but what it's actually doing is archiving the particular record that we've highlighted. we'll OK that. If we now go in and look at that record and go to check the information about it by clicking on Owner About This Record, the generation has now been set to 1, and it tells you that this record is in the archive. So it also tells you it's private and can't be replicated. And again, what that means is that if you now create a sync file to send to somebody else, that particular record that we've just archived will not be included in the sync file. However, it will be included in everything else you do with MapMate. For instance, if you create a map in MapMate, the archive records show up as dots on the map exactly the same as any other record. And if you run a query and export the results of the query to a spreadsheet, then the archiving makes no difference to that either. All the records will still appear in any of the queries. So the only thing that archive has an effect on is in creating sync files. So that was archiving just one record, and obviously you could go through and archive each of these records individually, but you can do all of them in one go if that's what you need to do, by clicking on the first record in the list, and then going down to the bottom and clicking on the grey box and pressing Shift first. So you do a Shift click, and that highlights the whole list, and we can now right-click anywhere over that list and archive those records. And again, we get the message warning us that it's going to be doing the archive. We can OK that. Once again, if we look at any one of these records now, we should see that it is in the archive. So that's fine, but perhaps at a later stage we have gone through and edited these records, and we now want to make sure that they do go on to the county recorder in the next sync file. To reverse the process, you just need to get the list of records back into your browse list. And once more, click on the top one, Shift click on the bottom one, right click over them, and this time the opposite of archive is to resynchronize. And if you resynchronize all those records, they will be brought back up to the current generation number. So we'll do that in this case. And now if we have a look at one of these records again, look at About This Record, it's back up to the current generation, generation 21. So that's just an example of how the generation numbers are used and how you can archive records to prevent them being synced out. One other place where you might see an effect of the generation numbers is with a query under the Browse Records heading, which is the query Browse all records in quarantine. Now, it would be quite useful if this query showed you all the records that you have in your archive at any moment, but in fact it doesn't do that. The quarantine is something else. If you import data from a tab text file, as covered in one of our other videos, you have the choice to bring that data in temporarily before you make the choice whether to save it permanently or not. And the quarantine records just refers to records that have been imported from a text file and are currently held in that temporary layer. So in many cases, on your copy of MapMate, if you run the query Browse all records in quarantine, you'll find that there's absolutely nothing in it. And as I say, it would be quite useful if there was a separate query that showed you all the records in the archive, but that doesn't come as a standard MapMate query. You would have to set that up as a custom query, and that can be done if you need to do so. It's the sort of thing that if you ask on the MapMate e-group, somebody will give you the SQL to allow you to do that. So, as I say, in the vast majority of cases when you're using MapMate, you don't need to worry about the generation numbers at all. But it's useful to have some understanding of them so that you can get an idea of how MapMate produces its sync files, and also so that you can make use of that archiving feature should you need to do so.